Civilization has always been a term of propaganda. When people actually try to define civilization, they usually struggle quite a lot. And they end up with things like a checklist of 10 different factors, so things like roads, the presence of cities, and also things like writing. Those, and long-distance trade, those aren't exactly convincing. Essentially all hunter-gatherers have long-distance trade, and you have very large empires like the Incan, for instance, which stretched all the way from Chile to Argentina, who did not have writing. When you actually try to think through, when people refer to civilization, what they're actually talking about, it's essentially the rise of dominance hierarchies, of societies in which a small group or a small number of individuals are ranked above everyone else and maintain that rank through the use of violence.
It's in some ways the most pressing question of our time. Will our society collapse? It's something I think about a lot. And there is a kind of collapse culture emerging at the moment. Among my environmentalist friends, it's become almost the default scenario for how climate change will play out. Among my friends in the AI risk world, they think often less about climate change, if only because their predictions for catastrophe tend to play out over the course of years and not decades. Meanwhile, Elon Musk has sometimes justified his extraordinary wealth by saying that he is going to rescue us all from a catastrophe that consumes the Earth by taking us to Mars. There is too much noise and not enough signal in this culture. We need some way to sort the real threats from the urgency washing. Fortunately, my guest this week has done just that work. Luke Kemp is a research affiliate at the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, better known as CSER, and he's also the author of Goliath's Curse, the history and future of societal collapse. We spoke about what Steven Pinker gets wrong about our tendencies towards violence, why collapse in history wasn't always actually that bad, but why it probably will be this time, and why ancient Rome was really the ISIS of its day. Luke Kemp, welcome to Do Your Own Research.
Richard, thanks for having me.
Over, I think about a week ago, from when I'm recording this, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists put out the latest iteration of the clock that tells us how many seconds we are to midnight. This is, to some extent, a PR stunt, but the idea basically is that it's an attempt to gauge how close we are to doom, disaster, and so on. What's your current assessment of where we are in the story of social collapse? How near are we? How far are we? How would you go about finding out?
Yeah, this is the doomsday clock, and my take is that you can't put a date on doomsday. The very best approaches we have to doing forecasting, so it's making numerical estimates about the future, is super forecasters, and they have very little accuracy beyond a decade. And the doomsday clock is not taking a super forecast approach. While we can't put a date on doomsday, what we can do is essentially understand the pressures that lead towards societal collapse, global catastrophe, or doom, and whether or not we're heading in the right direction or not. Long story short, I think we're heading in the wrong direction a whole bunch of ways. It would be, of course, the re-emergence of potential nuclear arms race, emissions still keep on going up, democratic backsliding, the rise of autocracies throughout the world, the list goes on. In general, I think the trajectory we're on in the long term, whether it be decades or centuries, does lead to global societal collapse. So if things don't look good, that, yeah. I think so, yeah. I think that's the most likely endpoint is self-termination. I wouldn't put a date on it, however.
And what does that look like? What is the process of that actually? I mean, does it depend on the kind of risk that drives it ultimately? Like, for example, obviously you get a very different kind of endpoint if you have a nuclear exchange than you would if you had climate change being the main source of risk. You get a different kind of social disintegration if it's from AI risk or from the proliferation of autonomous weapons or something like this. Like, what are the kinds of, when you're thinking about that landscape of risk, what are the particularly prominent things inside it that people should be paying attention to if they want to know how much longer, perhaps not them, but their society has to live?
We often talk about existential risk or global catastrophic risk, which essentially is referring to different threats that could cause either global societal collapse or, in the very worst case, human extinction. And these tend to include things like engineered pandemics, climate change, other global environmental problems like the loss of biosphere integrity, lethal autonomous weapons, aka killer robots, and super intelligent machines, which can either disempower us and enslave humanity or potentially destroy every single human being on Earth. It really depends upon how these things interact and intersect as to what kind of catastrophe you end up with. I like to think of this as a spectrum, all the way from the kind of fairly abrupt annihilation, which is probably most clearly manifest in either a nuclear global war, so in particular Russia and the US using essentially the entirety of their stockpiles, or something like superintelligence becoming real and potentially destroying pretty much everything in the space of a couple of days. On the other end of the spectrum, you end up with something which is much more of a creeping slow collapse. So you can imagine this in terms of both resource constraints, in particular the rising, or sorry, I should say falling energy ratio of fossil fuels. So essentially the amount of energy we get from fossil fuels compared to how much we have to spend to get fossil fuels out of the ground is getting worse and worse. And if that continues to get worse, you end up in a situation where we're just basically forced to slowly downscale societies. And that'll lead most likely to conflict, both class conflict as well as between countries. But the end result here is this kind of slowly declining standards of living, slow breakup of international global supply chains and industrial systems. If you want to use the term societal complexity, which I don't quite like, but if you're thinking in that terms, it's basically like a slow reduction of complexity, a slow reduction in industrial capacity. That itself could still be a collapse. So you have this big spectrum, and I think it's very difficult to tell where we're going to end up exactly. Again, I think the best approach here is to simply look at, for each of those different scenarios, for each of those different areas along the spectrum, what are the pressures and the drivers, and how are we heading? And unfortunately, I think for most of those, we're getting worse. I've already mentioned, of course, that when it comes to energy ratio of fossil fuels, things are getting worse, and there's no clear signs that's going to improve. And if you're looking at something like building dangerous machine intelligence, that's clearly getting worse with every passing month.
One of the things I find really interesting about that vast collection of different risks is that when I speak to my friends, for example, many of whom are involved in various ways in the environmental movement, many of whom are very concerned with the rise of the far right globally, and all of whom, I think, perhaps not all of whom, but like the vast majority of whom would say, oh, this idea about AI risk is it's nonsense, right? The thing we need to be worrying about with AI is, oh, actually, the really important thing is that AI is biased in various ways, that it will take people's jobs, but find the kind of science fiction projections, perhaps, or what they regard as science fiction projections, ludicrous to some extent. If you were talking to one of these people, and I should say I'm not one of these people, I do think AI risk is very serious. If you were talking to one of those people who thought, okay, well, 60% of what Luke is saying are the key drivers here, totally on board with. Yep. The other 40% are obviously wrong. Like, how do you convince someone that AI risk is a real thing at that kind of civilizational scale?
I would say think probabilistically. There's no plausible reason as to why we can't build machines that are more intelligent than us. And I have yet to see a really plausible takedown as to why those super intelligent machines could not lead to a scenario of either human enslavement or some other kind of catastrophe. I think where people stumble here is they tend to think this is really unlikely to happen in the next decade or coming decades. Yet, probability doesn't quite work like that. Even if this is simply a 1% chance that this happens in the next decade, which I think is a conservative but pretty decent estimate, if there's a 1% chance of destroying the entire world, you take that pretty seriously. And to me, that compels a very strong argument of just don't build it. And this is where I always found it strange as well, is that you end up with this really weird hostility between people who are worried about superintelligence and AI risk and people who are worried about near-term considerations. As you mentioned, things like AI bias and ethics, but also things like, say, for instance, the use of killer robots, lethal autonomous weapons. And it says petty politics. Ultimately, they both really want the same thing, which is slowing down and democratically controlling the use and development of machine intelligence. That's the end goal here. And regardless of the exact probability you put on us building superintelligence in the next few decades, whether it's 50% or 1%, I've yet to come across a reason to think this is something like 0.00001%. And given the consequences, you'd need a probability like that in order to just dismiss it. So I'd encourage everyone to just think about this probabilistically and think about it practically.
Right. And so there's a kind of I'm not going to label you with this, but there's a kind of what I think we've come to associate with effective altruist type of reasoning there. And I'm not saying that as a slur, because I actually have some sympathies for effective altruism here. A 1% risk of 1 billion people dying is actually in some ways worse than 100% chance of 10 people dying, right? This is the kind of it feels perverse, right? I totally understand that. It feels perverse to reason in that way and to think about ethics in that way. But that basically is the kind of the underlying thing there. In the process of writing the book, Goliath's Curse, everyone should go and buy it. I'm assuming everyone already has bought it. I think it's done amazingly well. But if you haven't, then if you're one of the very few, then you're missing out. Go and get it. But I want to sort of come to that question about effective altruism in terms of your story, right? So I don't know if you were ever a card-carrying effective altruist. Everyone I speak to says, oh no, I'm just EA adjacent. Never quite fully effective altruist. There's always someone who's more hardcore than me. Tell us about your political story, because you didn't end up as an effective altruist in the process of writing this book.
Yeah, I think most people who refer to themselves as EA adjacent, they tend to do so after Sam Bankman-Fried occurred.
Right.
So it's a good political face-saving approach. I had a period of flirting with effective altruism where when I first heard of it, it seemed almost too good to be true. I was someone who was deeply concerned about both climate change, but also in general, intergenerational equity. I thought about the really big questions around things like animal ethics, nuclear weapons. And I was also fairly practical in the way I approached life. I was vegetarian, I powerlifted, etc. And suddenly there's a whole group of people who do very similar things and also seem to have an intellectual curiosity across these things which other people don't. And not to mention a practical framework for addressing them. Where I started to diverge was both a certain political naivety, where it felt like most of effective altruism just simply had no interest in, nor approach to understanding power and politics, which to me is fundamental across all of this, whether it's understanding animal ethics or existential risk. And the second was just a certain creed of hero worship, where if you criticize people like Nick Bostrom or Will MacAskill, some of the foremost scholars in the field, you would automatically be derided and kind of in some way face an exodus of sorts, or exile, I should say. That led to me being a bit of a friendly critic of sorts for the EA community. That being said, I think there's a whole bunch of useful things in effective altruism. I think some of the basic ways of thinking, as you mentioned, trying to think probabilistically when it comes to risk can be very useful. But I think we should be very careful and not take the entire bundle of ideas from effective altruism or the ideology. So I'm still involved with EA to a certain extent, but I'm certainly not an effective altruist.
Adjacent.
Adjacent. I mean, it depends. I mean, if you're critical and outspoken, does it make you adjacent? Potentially. I'm adjacent insofar as I'm interested in the same areas and ideas as effective altruists are. But that being said, no one has a monopoly on thinking about things like global societal collapse or global ethics.
These topics, right? These factors, power concentration, inequality, and status competition, and so on. Those are the things that you're saying effective altruists struggle to really engage with. Often, they are also the core of your sense of the current risk landscape. Just talk us through the kind of the ways in which those feature in your theory. Why is it that these things are so deadly for societies?
One of the main motivations in writing this book was trying to think through what are the root causes of existential risk. If I was working at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk back in 1945, there's only one threat on my radar. That's nuclear weapons. Today, I have colleagues working on things like engineered pandemics, climate change, of course, nuclear weapons as well, and things like superintelligence. The risks just seem to be growing, which leads to the question of why is that? Why do we just seem to keep on generating these risks? And I've yet to see any good, effective altruist take on this. They just kind of more or less just take it for granted that we build technology and those technologies can sometimes potentially destroy the world. That doesn't seem particularly convincing to me. And hence, in order to identify the root causes, we have to also understand history in a very basic sense. In the book, I identify some of the root drivers here as being what I call the darker angels of our nature, a set of different psychological qualities across humanity, in particular in some people more so than others, which have interacted with environmental conditions, in particular the Holocene, the onset of a more stable, warm climatic period, which led to the creation of what I call dominance hierarchies or Goliaths, basically big societal structures built on dominance. One of the big ones I talk about here is status competition. We know that everyone wants status. That's a universal impulse. And we also have numerous studies suggesting that people who have more status tend to have more children, and they also have children who are more likely to live to adulthood. In short, there's a kind of evolutionary reproductive explanation for why we want status. There's different ways of pursuing status. Getting it just by giving benefits to your group, what we call prestige, not necessarily a bad thing. Unfortunately, there are those who try to get status through what's called dominance, which is essentially imposing violence, force, and costs upon others and getting status like that. And when you look at the history books, I should say, we tend to have a roll call of mass murderers, people like Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and they all very successfully got status, including their role in the history books, through the use of force, the ability to murder and starve thousands or hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people. Status competition is what drives the creation of these dominance hierarchies. Some people want to have a hierarchy where they are placed on top, and that requires a kind of dominance hierarchy where you're ranking people and classes. There's other things I mentioned, which I won't go too deeply into here, but in the book I also mentioned, for instance, the dark triad, that some people have a set of basically we all have a ranking on 3 different personality traits. And these include narcissism, an overvalued sense of self and ego, psychopathy, a lack of remorse and empathy, and a certain callousness, and Machiavellianism, a willingness to treat others as as a means to political ends. Everyone ranks on these, but some rank far higher than others. And of course, you do have genuine psychopaths, for instance. A key thing here is that people who rank high in the dark triad are much more likely to be dominant status seekers. They're much more likely to both want status and to seek it through dominance. And in general, they're more likely to get it as well. If we look at the modern world, roughly, at least amongst men, 1 in 100 people is going to pass the threshold for clinical psychopathy. If you go to boardrooms or parliaments, it raises to roughly 23%.
That's a big range, though. So
it's a huge range.
3 and 23%.
Yeah.
Like one in 30 to 1 in 4.
And part of this is both due to the difficulty in actually measuring this. Sometimes you have to rely upon behavioral tests. It's very difficult to actually go and say to a politician, hey, do you want to take this test on psychopathy? And part of this is also just the sheer range of different institutions we're dealing with here. You can have some corporations which just don't have it so much, some parliaments which have it a lot. So I think it's pretty understandable as a range, but there's no debate on the very basic tenet here that we tend to over-select for the worst of us.
In a kind of structural way, right? So
Precisely.
It's not just that people are sort of individually promoting themselves, but the institutions are also structured such that those people will rise to the top and so on. And so, I mean, we were talking just before we began recording about the question of sort of dialectics and about sort of social forcing. And so it's not just that you have evil people or sort of, not evil, that's probably the wrong word. You have people with sort of malevolent characteristics who then take over societies, but it's also that societies are organized in such a way as to allow these people more easily to take over, because there are certain kinds of institutions that benefit that kind of frame of mind. I even with that sort of, you know, dialectical version of it, or the kind of symbiotic version of it, I do feel a certain degree of unease, I have to say, because I would characterize what you've said as broadly anarchistic as a framework. Would you say that? You think that's fair?
Depends on how one defines anarchism, but taking the Scottian idea of what he calls the anarchist squint, which is basically just thinking through
how does James C. Scott.
Exactly.
Author of Seeing Like a State. Yeah.
Precisely. Seeing Like a Skate, Against the Grain, and also a couple other bangers like Weapons of the Week. And
The Art of Not Being Governed, which is an amazing book about Southeast Asia. I love that one. Because it's, have you got it up there? Okay.
And also, actually, personal favorite is Domination, the Arts of Resistance, but let's not go too much into Scott fandom. One of the things he points out is that anarchism is a very broad church. There's multiple different ways in which people think about what an anarchist society should look like, all the way from syndicalism through to very, very different visions. And Scott viewed anarchism less as one coherent moral philosophy and much more as an analytical tool. That you look at the world and you try to think through, why is a hierarchy there? And is it legitimate? And if not, you try to think about how we can deconstruct it. And in many ways, that is the motivating force or lens behind the book, which, of course, ends up being a kind of revisionist history. I also shared your disquiet and discomfort with thinking about things like the Dark Triad. I think the Dark Triad in particular has this vibe of being a bit pop psychology, a little bit something which people who are often gurus peddle in. But the truth is, it has a really good body of literature behind it. This is not something that is only used in pop psychology. It is a very well-respected body of evidence. And it's also just simply, I think, both hard to ignore, but also a mistake to ignore when we think about institutions. And looping back into what you were saying here about different kind of dialectics or different interactions between both people and the institutions, I like to think about this in three ways. Is A, people who are in the Dark Triad want power more. B, they have greater tools to get it, but also the institutions facilitate that. And C is once they get into power in these institutions, they tend to remake the institutions to also represent some of their pathologies, if you will. When you look at nation states or even corporations, they essentially behave in an incredibly psychopathic way. There's no attachment-based relationships. There's very little consideration of those often working within them, except for, of course, pure instrumental reasons. As I mentioned in the book, if you took the United States and you boiled it down to a single person, and then you went to go talk to that person, they would come across as an absolute arsehole. They would be basically self-aggrandizing and compliment themselves in every second sentence, be constantly stockpiling weapons, they'd be giving less than 1% of their wealth to the needy, and they'd be incredibly distrustful and suspicious of even their closest friends. They're just a pretty terrible person altogether. And yet most of institutions operate in exactly that kind of way. So I think it's not simply that we select for these individuals and they have great ability to do so, but then that has a feedback in which our institutions get molded by these kinds of people.
I should say that neither Luke's nor my resistance to the framework of the Dark Triad is coming out of the fact that either of us are very high on that measure of psychopathy. I've met
Important
Luke.
caveat.
He's a lovely man. I am also very nice.
Can confirm.
Do not believe that we are somehow resistant here. I guess what I want to come to with that, in that kind of that view of power, and I totally get it. I think it's a very useful view of power. At the same time, it feels to me relatively sort of hodgepodge. That we say, okay, well, here are the institutions like the United States, and it has a certain set of interests, and we can think about it as if it was sort of roughly analogous to a person, and then it looks like a complete psychopath. Other people, other theorists we've had on the show, will try and give a much broader framework. And so I've broadly characterized you as an anarchist. I hope that's, broadly speaking, accurate. And as you say, it's a very broad church. You are so close, Luke. It's time to go one step further and become a Marxist. So now this happens. Now your conversion experience happens. Isn't there something about capitalism and this modern, contemporary even version of the risk landscape that we have, where instead of dealing with sort of separate risks, indistinct, that are all unified by a single thing, and instead of even saying what you're saying, which is that there are kind of collections of drivers of inequality and competition and the internal kind of power struggles that produce these kind of collection of risks, isn't there something even more abstract behind that we could label capitalism? Or do you just like not really see the kind of the utility of having that kind of abstraction over the whole thing? Because in your book, you talk about Goliaths, right? But you don't necessarily, and you do talk about capitalism a couple of times.
Yeah.
But like, how do you see the utility of that kind of very large framework? Or is that not useful for thinking about history at the scale? And I should say, you go a long, long, long way back, and we can go there in a second. But like, is there something about that term or that framework that's not useful for what you're trying to do?
I do try to put forward a bigger structural abstraction here. That is, as you mentioned, that of Goliath. And I think capitalism is useful to think about, but I think it's only part of the global structural problem we face today. In the book, I employ a modified version of Michael Mann's sources of social power. So Mann originally tried to think about power in 4 different ways, which you have beautifully illustrated there on the map. So economic, political, ideological, and military. I have a slight revision of him here, where basically I think rather than ideological, we should think about information power in general. It's not just simply the priests who have power, but it's also the bureaucrats. And today I would say that Google often has more power than many churches do. So it's information power writ large. And when it comes to military power, I rebrand that as violent power, because it's often not just militaries, it can be non-military groups, including terrorist groups, for instance, who can wield great deals of violent power. And apart from that, I add one, you could think of it as different source power. I think of it as an amplifier, which is demographic power. If you have a larger group of people who have more skills, for instance, then suddenly your power becomes much, much more amplified. And that's, of course, what we see today in certain countries like the United States, where you have much larger populations who are at least more highly technically skilled in certain areas, like building bombs, for instance. That leads to far more greater power for, say, for instance, the executive of the United States than the executive of Bhutan. In that telling, I try to think about the world in terms of what are the big power constellations we have. When it comes to economic power, pretty clear cut, we have global capitalism. But when it comes to political power, it's interesting that essentially every single part of the world is organized as a nation state. You pretty much have to be a nation state with some kind of executive in order to go to the UN, for instance. When it comes to informational power, we have a couple of big firms who control all the vast flows of data throughout the world. If you look at the top 10 firms by market capitalization, the top 6 are all basically information firms. Google, Apple, Meta, Amazon, etc. And they're all essentially global as well. And when you look at violent power, it's pretty noticeable that all the world's biggest powers, the great powers like China, Russia, and the US, despite having apparently very different views of the world, very different cultures, they have surprisingly similar militaries. They all have an air force, they'll have an army, they'll have a navy. They're structured along very strict chains of command. They all have nuclear weapons as well, and they're all interested in building larger and larger fleets of autonomous lethal weapons like drones. So the key argument I put forward here is that these clusters of different power networks, including capitalism, not just capitalism, you can think of as one large global Goliath, one large dominance hierarchy. I think capitalism is part of the story, but I think it would be a mistake to think that it's the entirety of the story. And one very easy example here is that it wasn't just the United States who built up huge amounts of nuclear weapons and had a huge environmental impact throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It was also the Soviet Union, which was explicitly anti-capitalist. So I don't think this is as clear-cut as capitalism being the key driver. I think there's actually a bigger abstraction behind that, which is Goliath.
I'm going to write out 1,000 times, I will not get into the state capitalist debate about the Soviet Union. So, okay, I'll zip my mouth there. But yes, broadly speaking, I agree with you that there are economic determination factors, political. I think the shift from ideological to informational, I think it's really useful. And violent power as a general expression, I think all incredibly useful frameworks for thinking about the multiplicity of the ways of power that currently exist. Clearly, though, they are all increasingly actually quite deeply integrated, right? It's not like you have informational power that is separate from military power, right? Absolutely. These are, the control of the informational landscape. We're talking with Susanna Glickman about the sort of military revolution in network organization, so you can absorb and use information in a more efficient way. Right? Yep. These are all sort of fundamental parts. Let's go a long way back though, because in order to, once we sort of released ourselves from the capitalism trap, or the kind of the trap of the abstraction of capitalism, we can then sort of roam pretty freely across history.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the Paleolithic. First of all, when was the Paleolithic?
The Paleolithic began approximately 3.3 million years ago. We tend to break up the Paleolithic into three different sections. One is the Lower Paleolithic, which is essentially from 3.3 million years ago to roughly 300,000 years ago. The Middle Paleolithic, which is from roughly 300,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago. And the Upper Paleolithic, which is from 40,000 years ago to approximately 10,000, 11,000 years ago with the onset of the Holocene. The Paleolithic derives from ancient Greek and means the Stone Age or the Old Stone Age, but is essentially referring to a period of recurring ice ages in which humanity developed. In the book, I focus primarily upon the Middle Paleolithic, since humans, at least anatomically modern humans, seem to have developed roughly 300,000 to 400,000 years ago. The Paleolithic is, if you will, the cradle of humanity. It's where we develop the most basic evolutionary drivers, and it's where, if you want to understand any notion or idea of human nature, you have to ultimately go back to.
We have very strong sort of views about what that was like. I mean, quite aside from, say, like the Flintstones and so on, we have very clear views of what the Paleolithic, what conditions were like in our minds, and lots of those come from quite unsubstantiated views of that period. I'm thinking in particular two sort of people we might want to critique or sort of revise their ideas. The first one, of course, is Thomas Hobbes, right? The great kind of early political thinker, in some ways the foundation of lots of modern political theory, who describes, prehistoric man as famously nasty, brutish, and short, and the life of the people then. But then we also have more modern thinkers, for example, Steven Pinker, who makes this claim that violent deaths were between 15 and 25% during the Paleolithic. And the reason why this is significant is because it motivates an idea in Steven Pinker's work, which is that since the sort of the dawn of time, if you want to talk in this kind of way, since that kind of early period of human history, we've been gradually tending towards lesser and lesser violence. This is what he calls the better angels of our nature. Is there anything to that theory? Are we looking at a kind of a more or less linear progress, at least along that dimension of, say, amount of interpersonal violence causing people's deaths?
In short, no, and Pinker is stunningly wrong both in the use of his evidence as well as the conclusions he draws. Pinker comes up with this range of roughly, he says 15%, but the range is more 15-25% when you consider others who have a very similar perspective as Pinker, and that is that the Paleolithic was essentially a bloodbath. It's worthwhile just saying on a side note that I always found this a strange idea to believe, that we managed to persevere through these recurrent ice ages, incredibly challenging, scarce environmental conditions, where all other human species, including Denisovans, Floriensis, Neanderthals, all died out, despite the fact that if you were born, there was a 1 in 4 chance of being killed by someone else. And if that was the case, it would have made, for instance, say for example, trade very, very difficult. It would have made swapping people across groups and ensuring an adequate amount of genetic diversity also very difficult. In short, it's an evolutionary recipe for extinction. That aside, that kind of logical rebuttal aside, the evidence that Pinker draws upon is fairly flawed. There was one review by an archaeologist who looked at the different examples Pinker was drawing from in order to calculate 15%. And interestingly, the biggest problem here is that apart from the fact that there's like 4 duplicates, the only site that actually goes back to the Paleolithic is called Jebel Sahaba. And Jebel Sahaba is pretty famous amongst archaeologists because it's incredibly exceptional. It occurred essentially as we were going into the Holocene, so it was already environmentally tumultuous conditions. The area, which I believe is in Sudan today, where Jebel Sahaba occurred, was essentially undergoing a huge change, which more or less clefted an entire valley into the area. So these people were living through exceptional, extraordinary times. Jebel Sahaba has, I believe, something like 53 skeletons. I have to look up the exact number again. But it's essentially the earliest example we have of large-scale, violence-based mortality. When you take a broader view across the Paleolithic, rather than doing what Pinker did and just kind of cherry pick a whole bunch of examples from modern day hunter-gatherers, you end up with a very different picture. The best study here was done by Haas and Pistelli, who are two archaeologists at the Chicago Field Museum, where they looked across over 4,000 different skeletons and 300 different sites. And what they found was that there's very few signs of violence. They came up with only a couple, one of course with Jebel Sahaba. The others included 3 different signs of people who had some kind of signs of violence, whether it be a projectile embedded into their body. But even in those cases, it's hard to tell if that was just a hunting accident, for instance. We don't know if that was actual violence. And another which was a triple burial, but it actually had no signs of violence on the skeletons that were buried. So in short, across all those hundreds of sites and thousands of skeletons, the only example of violence I could come across was Jebel Sahaba, which once again is not exactly emblematic of the Paleolithic. But you don't have to just look at skeletons. We can also think about this in terms of other lines of evidence. And one other line of evidence that points strongly against Pinker here is genetic. The best study we have of what's called basically what they try to do is the researchers more or less look at what do we know of other species that kill other members of their own species, and they basically try to create a big phylogenetic tree and then try to map out what species are humans closest to here. And of course, it's apes, chimpanzees, and others. And they come up with an estimate of roughly 1.3% of violence. So for every 100 humans born, roughly 1 would die at the hands of another human, which is, 15 times lower than what Pinker has. That's genetic, and that's also could be potentially too large, too small. It's a fairly uncertain study. But additionally, when you actually look at what we're like when it comes to killing, it's pretty clear we're not really hardwired to be killers. There's numerous studies from what some people call the field of killology, which is essentially studies of things like battlefield killology. Yeah, essentially how people kill each other, particularly in war zones. It involves things like doing battlefield reenactments, looking at like artifacts, looking at muskets that were used during the Civil War. And it comes up again and again that most people don't like to kill other people, and they often intentionally do a bunch of things like firing away from enemy lines, firing too high up. There's a great study here in one Civil War site which basically found a very large number of muskets which essentially they were completely full with musket powder and ball bearings. And the key explanation here is that the best way to not shoot is to look like you're constantly loading your rifle.
Right.
But in short, we just don't have much evidence that people really enjoy killing each other, which you'd kind of expect if roughly a quarter of us were dying at the hands of another human being. So most of the lines of evidence here, indeed all the lines of evidence here, point strongly against Pinker's key conclusion. And when what we return to this bigger picture of how do we survive, it becomes quite clear that it's just untenable to think that we were constantly killing each other and we weren't capable of large-scale cooperation, as both Hobbes and Pinker put forward. Just on Pinker very briefly, I do think where he has some validity is the idea that across a good chunk of human history, not the Paleolithic, but essentially from the first states onwards, you do see some kind of pacification process occurring. There's a pretty strong evidential basis that from the first states during what's called the Chalcolithic period through to pretty much the modern world, you do seem to have a decrease in violence. But it's more ending up as kind of a U-shape, where we actually have pretty low rates of violence during the Paleolithic. It rises spectacularly during both the Neolithic and the creation of the first states, and then it starts to dip all the way through to the modern world. And interestingly, the modern world probably has similar rates of violence to what you see in the Paleolithic, where today it's roughly globally 1.3% as well, I think, along those lines. It ends up being over 2%. Yeah, it ends up being over 2% once you include people taking their own lives, for instance. But the rate of actual violence in terms of people killing each other seems to have been, at least according to best estimates, relatively similar. Caveats here being that the number of skeletons we have from the Paleolithic is only, of course, a very small fraction of the number of people who actually lived. So we have to take at least this skeletal evidence with a pinch of salt. But the important point here is that all the lines of evidence, genetic, findings from archaeology, and archaeological, all point in the same direction. And it's that we're capable of killing each other, but we don't particularly like to do so.
So our kind of general topic here is collapse, right? The disintegration of social structure. There are lots of sort of nuances to the way in which we think about that. But it seems like in the Paleolithic, I mean, there are these enormous changes, right? So we've got a collection of massive climatic shifts, right? Which is why we no longer are in an ice age. Right? There has to be these shifts for that to happen. But the societies that you write about seem not exactly stable, right? But they're also not exactly kind of falling apart all the time. They're kind of what you describe as a fluid civilization. Can you just characterize that for us? What is a fluid civilization and how does it work?
So in the book, I try to interrogate the term civilization and come up with a more defensible and logical definition for what is a civilization. Civilization has always been a term of propaganda. It derives from the Latin civilitas, which has these connotations of things like good political conduct, virtue, wisdom. And yet, when people actually try to define civilization, they usually struggle quite a lot. And they end up with things like, for instance, in the case of Gordon Childe, a very famous Australian archaeologist, a checklist of 10 different factors. So things like roads, the presence of cities, and also things like writing. Those and long-distance trade, those aren't exactly convincing. Essentially, all hunter-gatherers have long-distance trade. And you have very large empires like the Incan, for instance, which stretched all the way from Chile to Argentina, who did not have writing. Or you end up with something which just is fairly vague and also fairly prejudiced, like the idea that civilization is an advanced culture. When you actually try to think through, when people refer to civilization, what they're actually talking about, it's essentially the rise of dominance hierarchies, of societies in which a small group or a small number of individuals are ranked above everyone else and maintain that rank through the use of violence. And that's true of the rise of, say, for instance, the first dynasty of Egypt, the very first dynasties of China, or the very first states in Mesopotamia, what people tend to think about as being the cradles of civilization. When I talk about civilization, I want to go back to what people are usually referring to in terms of civilized conduct. It's really about having large-scale cooperation that is voluntary and is not based upon the use of violence. And I think the Paleolithic seems to be an example of that. So in the Paleolithic, contrary to popular belief, we do actually see people seemingly doing trade and economic cooperation across huge areas of land. So all the way from the east coast to the west coast of Africa, roughly 150,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, we have evidence of trade in things like musical instruments, different ornamental gifts and decorations, weapons, so things like lithics, tools, stone blades, and also just simply genetics and culture. So we have very good evidence that people are essentially trading and moving across groups all the way from one side of the continent to the other. We have similar evidence of this happening in North America. Essentially all across North America, you have very similar shaped stone tools and arrowheads. And likewise, what's called the Aurignacian culture, roughly 40,000 years ago, across a very good chunk of Europe, all the way from Spain to Russia. You have evidence of things like similar figurines, similar culture, similar cave art drawings. All of those suggest that people were both trading and also moving across groups quite a lot, which makes sense because you basically can't survive as a species unless you have a large amount of genetic diversity, unless people are constantly moving across groups. And we actually see that today with modern hunter-gatherers as well. So modern nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers, they don't tend to just stay in a group of, say, 20 to 50 people who are all close family members. Instead, usually less than 10% of the group is actually closely blood related, and people are constantly moving across groups to the extent that one person probably knows thousands of people and has thousands of social connections over their lifetime. So they're actually much more similar to us in that regard than we think. And interestingly, this seems to be one of the reasons why we survive, while other humans like Neanderthals, for instance, die out. the leading hypothesis now as to why Neanderthals die out is not that humans killed them off. There's only 2 examples of violence on Neanderthal skeletons, and we don't actually know if those were caused by Homo sapiens. Instead, it's that Neanderthals were very genetically homogeneous. There's at least one site which basically found a group of Neanderthal skeletons who had a genetic diversity that is similar to what we find in endangered mountain gorillas. They had smaller communities, less intermingling, and they were just much more fractured, which meant in general, if you had any kind of catastrophe, whether that be a disease or a change in the climate, it only took a small number of deaths and a small change in the ratio of births to deaths to potentially cause a community to go extinct and eventually their entire species to go extinct. By comparison, we're incredibly genetically diverse because we're constantly changing across groups. So when I talk about fluid civilizations, it's this idea that in the Paleolithic, we don't have any signs of these big hierarchies built on violence. So cooperation seems to be fundamentally voluntary and non-violent. And it's fluid insofar as people are constantly changing across different groups. And
so it sounds, in some ways, great.
It's, I think, much better than people expect. This is also a time it's important to remember that we don't really have what people refer to as the disease of civilization. So things like influenza, smallpox don't actually occur until after you get large-scale cities and states. It wouldn't have been perfect. Bear in mind that during this period, roughly 1 in 2 children that were born wouldn't have made it through to adulthood. We don't have things like antibiotics. Life still involves at some stages hard labor, but all that being said, it doesn't seem to be particularly bad as well. Violence is pretty low. People live lives that, if you make it that old, just aren't that bad and tend to live pretty long lives. When you look at modern day nomadic egalitarians, interestingly, they have a whole bunch of weird kind of health benefits. So their brains seem to actually shrink less as they age, for instance. They have kind of less neurodegenerative disorders. They also seem to have pretty good diets, which result in better cardiovascular health. The Somali people in particular have basically the best cardiovascular health of any group studied on Earth. They also have more diverse microflora in their guts. They are, I believe they are South American, actually.
Right.
I was getting confused with the biohacker. In short, there seems to be a whole bunch of benefits here. And I don't think we should fall into thinking this is the best group possible and we should all return to being hunter-gatherers. I'm not a anarcho-primitivist, as some people have accused me of. But I think if I was given the choice between whether I'm going to be randomly regenerated in the modern world and have a better chance of being born, as I say, for instance, an Indian peasant, or being born the Neolithic, or being born the Paleolithic, I'd choose the Paleolithic.
You probably wouldn't be a vegetarian though, and you probably wouldn't be extra
That is true, but for me,
these are key considerations.
That is true. Although I would have the opportunity to exercise pretty regularly, and the very least, the meat I consumed would not be from factory farmed animals, so that wouldn't be too big a sacrifice.
So, because it sounds actually comparatively quite nice. I mean, you're giving all these caveats, which I think are really important. 50% infant mortality is a huge number, but it does sound quite nice. How did we, or why did we leave this situation? And you also have this other really fascinating sort of line of thought in the book, which is that it wasn't like people sort of linearly transitioned. Of course, we have to think about the invention of farming and so on. It wasn't that this was sort of, okay, now we're doing farming and that just sticks around forever. There are loads of moments in history where people very deliberately try and go backwards in that sort of linear story, right? But they try and find places where they have more opportunity, or they find places in which they have more choice and they are less dominated. Can you talk us both about through that kind of like that transitional period, and then also what were the struggles inside that transitional period against for people who were trying to resist the formation of the first states, or people who are trying to, in fact, sort of just like go back to a better way of life more generally?
It's worthwhile taking a step back, first of all, and just linking collapse with this study of the Paleolithic. So one of the reasons I went back to the Paleolithic is both to understand the root causes, understand what I call human evolutionary inclinations, but basically human nature, if you will. But another big one is that when people think about collapse, they're basically thinking about a reversion to a social order in which there is no king, no clear authority, no ruler. And Hobbes, interestingly, wasn't talking about the Paleolithic when he talks about the life of man being nasty, brutish, and short. He's just thinking in general about the state of nature, exactly. Basically, a situation in which there are no rulers, there's no authorities. And the Paleolithic is often compared to that because it does seem to be that kind of situation where you don't have social dominance hierarchies, you don't have rulers. Interestingly, what it conveys is that people seem to do pretty okay. We're capable of doing large-scale cooperation and not killing each other, even if we don't have a police force and monarchs looking over us. And this is also something you see in the study of disaster risk management, that when you have big disasters, whether it be terrorist attacks, tsunamis, earthquakes, people tend to respond pretty pro-socially and pretty well. There's a great example here, what's called boat lift, which was the largest maritime evacuation, even dwarfing Dunkirk, so the movement of troops away from continental Europe back to the UK homeland. And this happened in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, where basically a huge number of people needed to be moved from, I think, over 500,000 from Manhattan across the Hudson River. And the Coast Guard didn't have enough boats. They basically put out a big call for, can people help out? And suddenly, just an enormous amount of yachts, small fishing boats, etc., all convened together to ferry across over 500,000 people in the space of less than 24 hours. That's how people tend to react during periods of crisis. And that's a pretty good nudge towards, we're actually not that bad. But as you mentioned, this becomes a question of how do we end up with the social structures that we usually associate with collapse? How do we end up with these big Goliaths? In the book, I talk about 3 different important environmental factors, what I call Goliath fuel. When you enter the Holocene, you're entering a period of warmth and a more stable climate. And what that means is suddenly you can start to grow things like grain, and you also have access to things like fish. Interestingly, we find that it's not only farmers who end up developing these big kingdoms and empires. That used to be the typical story told by Marx and others, is that once you get a very large number of people relying upon grain, you end up needing essentially to have managers, rulers, lords, etc., to more or less coordinate the much larger population economic projects. That never quite made sense to me for a number of reasons, including you actually see things like cities, large monuments, etc., occurring before you get rulers. Göbekli Tepe being one of the famous examples, but there are many others as well. And additionally, you have many areas across the world which don't have agriculture, but which do have agriculture, but don't end up with kingdoms or empires. And similarly, you have a whole bunch of hunter-gatherers who end up organizing themselves in surprisingly hierarchical ways. They end up having slaves, they do warfare, and they have big chiefs as well. And often they even settle, at least for part of the year, in small but dense sedentary towns. Instead, what explains all this is the type of resource that is being used. It's not just having a surplus, it's the type of surplus. So in particular, you need to have resources that are easily seen, stolen, and stored. In the book, I put forward the comparison between New Guinea and Egypt. Both of these areas had agriculture roughly the same time, approximately 7,000 years ago. And yet Egypt develops pharaohs and pyramids, New Guinea never does. And the key difference here is New Guinea, they're growing taro and bananas. Taro, you can basically store underground. It's not very visible. And even after it's ready to be eaten, you can actually keep it underground for a long period of time. And it only stores, once you dig it up, for roughly 6 months tops. Bananas, you can only store for a couple of weeks. The key thing here is that grain, by comparison, wheat, as grown by the Egyptians, is both very easily seen. It basically advertises when it's ready to be harvested. It's very easily stored. It can be stored for decades at a time. And that makes it highly lootable. It's also very mobile as well. When you look across the world, the areas that develop states, that develop kingdoms and empires, they all have lootable resources, in particular in the form of grain. It also explains where you get these hierarchical hunter-gatherers. These hunter-gatherers are ones who have access to fish that can be smoked and stored, which becomes a kind of primal lootable resource. That's one form of Goliath fuel. The other is what I call monopolized weapons. In short, weapons that can be controlled by a small group of society and used to have a military advantage over everyone else. You don't see the first states popping up in Mesopotamia with Uruk or with the first dynasty of Egypt until you have the introduction of handheld bronze axes and swords, for instance. The same is true of China, with the Shang dynasty as well, or the Shah dynasty, I should say. And the last but important form of Goliath fuel is what I call caged land. In short, people have fewer exit options to move around and to move away from a emerging autocracy. And this can be due to both just the sheer geography. So when you look at, say, for instance, Egypt, it's buffered between the Nile and the Red Sea. Mesopotamia literally means the land between two rivers in Greek because it's cordoned off between the Tigris and the Euphrates. In short, people had, in the key areas of where Goliaths emerged, less room to move. But additionally, once you start to rely upon grain, you just by nature also have less ability to move as well. But those three factors all lead to a situation in which essentially everyone starts to have to put up and accept the emergence of a Goliath structure. But what you really see here is not a voluntary creation of big, glorious civilizations, but rather a story of organized crime, where a small group of people basically start to set up a monopoly over key resources using violence.
And this leads to the thing that I sort of identify as your most anarchist statements. Perhaps not the most anarchist statement, actually. Maybe the one, maybe your claim that Rome is like ISIS is perhaps like more quintessentially anarchist, and we'll get to there in a second. But the idea that states are fundamentally criminal enterprises, that they emerge out of the organization of a sort of almost like mafia-like structure. You know, that seems to be like a very surprising kind of view of how the state works, especially for someone who comes from a background in sort of the broader kind of liberal continuity or liberal continuum of effective altruists, right? Was there a moment when you were looking at the evidence and you were trying to assess this question, and you probably had the sort of the classic liberal story in the back of your head? Was there a particular moment that you remember that kind of broke you and thought, okay, well, here it is. Here is the truth of the state?
The closest I had to one single pivotal moment was reading, as you'd expect, James C. Scott Against the Grain in 2018, which was kind of one of my big initial forays into revisionist history. And Scott really eloquently puts forward the case that states are essentially criminal rackets. That being said, once you look more deeply into it, it just becomes fairly uncontroversial and self-evident. And there's a very long intellectual kind of history here in lineage. It's not just people like Scott. There's much, much older thinkers who talk about the state as being a criminal racket. And it also is something you can see even in the modern world. So there's a whole bunch of different studies, for instance, of different areas in Africa, in particular in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where once you have mineral price shocks, so in particular once they looked at the big price shocks, so increase in the price of things like gold and coltan, and what you see is suddenly you start to have essentially rebel protection rackets set up around the mines who can start to charge the miners as they're digging up these resources. But interestingly, these militias also start to both organize themselves hierarchically, but they also start to institute things like taxes. They start to have basically like regulations, court systems, dispute settlement, all the things we usually associate with a state, which just logically makes sense. If you want to have a populace which you can take resources from in an enduring long-term fashion, you kind of need to have all that infrastructure. You need to offer some benefits as well to justify yourself. And one really interesting thing here is that resources that were less lootable, that were more easily hidden, say for instance gold, where you tend to have very small amounts which you can either swallow or potentially hide in other ways, they had to become both usually more democratic but also more bureaucratic. They had to put in place things like market taxes and poll taxes, while in the case of coltan, which you basically pick up in these big chunks, they're very lootable, they're very easy to see, it was less bureaucratic and more autocratic, which is something we see across the world as well. Areas which have more lootable resources and developed states earlier, such as, say, for instance, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China, they remained autocratic to this very day. While ones which had less lootable resources, less observable resources, they tend to become more likely to end up being democratic, like in Europe, for instance. So
I guess sorry, when you're talking about the DRC there, the Democratic Republic of Congo, are you talking about post-war 1970s, 1980s, 1990s DRC, or are you talking about the DRC a long, 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 long time ago?
this study in particular was done post-war. I believe it was done in the 1990s.
This is another kind of aspect of collapse that I want to kind of put to you, which is, it's something that I think about when I'm writing about this kind of thing as well. I think about it as applied collapsology. Because the other major aspect of the development of the Congo in particular, right, is that there are a series of coups, many of them backed by the US, that deliberately try and destroy the democratically elected governments of the Congo. And I wonder, when we're thinking about collapse, like how much should we be thinking about the ways in which societies are deliberately destroyed by external enemies who wish to sort of disintegrate them? I mean, the classic example here would, of course, be Iraq, right? So in 2003, like the Americans and the British, and I think even the Australians, so you're not getting out of this one, Luke, go into Iraq. And one of the things that Paul Brenner does when he's the head of the provisional authority, right, is he deliberately makes it so that people who are members of the Ba'ath Party can't be members of the government, and he also disbands the Iraqi army completely. Right, these are the two major orders he makes, I think, on the same day, and that completely disintegrates Iraqi society, and that's where you get the insurgency from. Right, so it's like I totally understand the sort of the story about, that's a different example from the Congo. Sorry, I'm confusing two things now, but I totally understand like why you would give this kind of resource account. But there are also these massive political factors about the way in which democracy was deliberately frustrated by CIA-backed coups in Africa. Isn't that like a major part of this story, and indeed the American-led invasion of Iraq?
I think that is true when you look at state formation across much of history, but not necessarily for the original states. For the very first pioneers that didn't have any neighbors, that didn't have any external force to basically come in and force a state hierarchy upon them. These were pioneering experiments in building a dominance hierarchy. I think you are right, and there's an important point here around considering both what people would think of as external shocks that cause collapse versus internal factors. And when people talk about collapse, they tend to be thinking about the internal factors.
Yep.
I think it's usually impossible to distinguish and perfectly surgically separate the two. If we look at the very classic examples like Rome, for instance, it's very difficult to just talk about this as being an external shock of both climate change, disease, and also barbarian invaders, the Germanic tribes from the north. And similarly, you can think of the Aztecs in a very similar way, in that, yes, it was a certain element of guns, germs, and steel. It was about Spanish conquistadors with superior weaponry. But in the book, I also point out that there's a whole bunch of examples where similar groups were repelled very effectively, like in the early case of the Maya. And the reason the Aztecs seemed to fall apart is also because they had a whole bunch of internal vulnerabilities. In particular, it was very easy for Cortez to find different groups who were willing to rebel against the Aztec Empire. Yep. And when Cortez actually marches upon and eventually takes Tenochtitlan in a second siege, it's at the head of an army which is roughly 100,000, 200,000 strong, and 95% plus of those are indigenous allies. Similarly, Rome, it's really difficult to avoid the internal factors that made Rome much weaker and meant that suddenly Germanic tribes to the north were a threat, and when most of history, they'd handle them pretty easily and pretty well. So I think it's very difficult to separate internal vulnerability away from external shocks. I just realized there's one important point we hadn't covered, which you mentioned, is the big time lags we have when it comes to the creation of these very first Goliaths. So it's worthwhile pointing out that you had the emergence of livable resources and things like that roughly 11,700 years ago with the onset of the Holocene. And yet you don't see the first Goliaths emerging across the world until roughly 5,000 years ago. That's a lag of 6,000 plus years. And even when you look at, say, for instance, a lag between the intensification of agriculture, having large-scale agriculture, and states, it's also an average across the world of roughly 3,000 years. So while we often talk about this as a revolution, the agricultural revolution, it was revolutionary in its consequences. It was not revolutionary in its pace. This was a very slow process with multiple different setbacks. In the book, I go through a whole bunch of these, including many of the earlier cities, which seem to have kind of internal revolutions of sorts. And in many cases, people never actually end up rebuilding the Goliath. One very notable case is the very first city, the very first kind of proto-state in the US, what's called Cahokia, which is a collection of over 200 big mounds on the outskirts of St. Louis, 500 kilometers southwest of Chicago, where you start to see something kind of like a Mayan city-state popping up with rulers who sacrifice people, most likely atop these pyramid-shaped mounds, and are more or less organizing a dominance hierarchy. That falls apart after roughly 150 years, and it's never rebuilt.
And is this the place where, because there's somewhere in the book that you write about a culture that essentially produces an oral tradition, so a collection of stories, a collection of songs maybe, that people tell each other about the bad old times as a kind of warning against the idea that you should create the Goliath, right? Is this the place that you're thinking of?
Not quite. It's linked, however. So Cahokia, when it collapses, is part of a series of different kind of fledgling Goliaths across the United States. Not just Cahokia, there's also, for instance, the Puebloan communities in the US Southwest. There's also what's called Moundville in the Appalachians. All of them more or less different dominance hierarchies are being created that are usually based upon corn. So when you look at the creation of these different communities, they more or less happen after you have the importation of what are called the Three Sisters, squash, beans, and corn, aka maize, from Central America, in particular kind of the Mayan city-states, the Zapotec and the later Aztec, up through the US Southwest along the Mississippi. And wherever you have corn, it tends to also result in these dominance hierarchies, Goliath fuel. Interestingly, they all fall apart roughly the same time during the Little Ice Age, and people don't remember them very fondly. So there's the case, for instance, in the Puebloan communities where they have this story of the Great Gambler, which is of this god who comes to Earth, who's preternaturally good at gambling, and essentially tricks everyone into giving away their children, wives, property. And in an effort to get them back, the Great Gambler tells them, I'll give them back to you if you build me these great sandstone houses, which is what we know the Puebloans by today. And then eventually in their story and retelling, the Great Gambler is overthrown by a big coalition, a revolution, if you will, between the everyday people and a bunch of other gods as well. There's very similar stories from the Huhugam, who were basically in modern-day Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix actually named after them because the original European explorers came across these old irrigation channels and temple pyramids that were from the Huhugam and basically wanted to rebuild like a phoenix from the ashes of an old civilization. They had a very similar story. And Moundville, the people there, have the story of the Inequality, who are basically an evil priestly class who eventually turned increasingly corrupt and even cannibalistic until eventually they were overthrown as well. But in each of those cases, they remember Goliaths very differently to how we think about Rome, Egypt, or China, for instance. I would say they probably have a much more accurate depiction as viewing this as a cautionary tale. Cahokia is different and perhaps even more telling in that Cahokia has no oral tradition. You have a city of 10,000 to 15,000 people pop up and fall apart, and there's no stories amongst the Native Americans about it whatsoever. It's almost as if they wanted to leave it rotting in the swamps of the Mississippi. And at least for a few hundred years afterwards, people avoid that area. It is eventually repopulated, but at least for a century or two thereafter, people seem to avoid having any built-up infrastructural communities in the area where Cahokia was, what becomes known as the vacant quarter.
Just a kind of a mass forgetting, or do you think there's something more deliberate in that?
I think it's more deliberate. It's impossible to tell, of course, but it would be kind of weird to just forget that. And it would also be weird that people just, independently also were like, yeah, let's just avoid this area. I think that almost certainly points towards some kind of collective social taboo.
It's almost like, there was another very famous book called The Dawn of Everything, written by David Graeber and David Wengrow, which argues about that there is a certain degree of sort of flexibility in political structure that people actually, in kind of a similar way that you're talking about, resisted the imposition of states. They wanted to maintain degrees of choice, degrees of sort of freedom in their lives. Where do you have similarities with that narrative? Where do you agree with David Graeber and where do you sort of disagree with them?
Yeah, this is an important one to me because it's a personal bugbear that I often see people comparing the book to The Dawn of Everything and being like, oh, this is already come from The Dawn of Everything. The key problem here being that there's a similarity insofar as we draw upon some similar case studies. We both talk about things like Teotihuacan, Cahokia. We both cover Göbekli Tepe and many others. The differences beyond that are manifold. In particular, Wenger and Graeber don't think that we evolved as nomadic egalitarian hunter-gatherers. They think we were likely in a state of kind of fluid flux between being egalitarian and also being hierarchical throughout most of human history. And they point towards a whole bunch of studies from different hunter-gatherer and forager groups across the world, where you do see this kind of interesting flux. This includes the Inuit, who basically organize differently in winter in comparison to summer. During summer, you basically have like small patriarchal family units. And during winter, everyone gets together in a much larger group. It tends to become far less patriarchal. And additionally, they even have like different sexual norms where things like partner sharing is encouraged. But in short, the entire social structure morphs with the seasons, and you see this with a whole bunch of different people, including the Cheyenne of the Great Plains. And there are definitely examples of this. We don't have any evidence of this happening during the Paleolithic. And indeed, it would have been difficult to actually have these seasonal shifts just because the seasons didn't happen in the same way during the Ice Age. And indeed, seasons don't happen the same way in Africa or even in Australia, for instance, in comparison to Europe. Like, we don't really have a really deep winter with snows, etc. in Australia. We don't have really long days during summer, for instance, in Australia. So I think, and also just beyond that, there's just no good archaeological evidence that this happened, that there were hierarchies throughout the Paleolithic. And you almost certainly would expect, given 300,000 years, they would have left some evidence of there being a whole bunch of leaders and rulers going over. The bigger difference here is the explanation. Wenger and Graeber talk about this as basically being more or less an entirely cultural explanation, that we once had a superpower of being able to thoughtfully and deliberately change our social structures, and that we somehow lost this when we began adopting states and Goliaths. And they struggle to explain exactly how. There's some kind of weird, haphazard, and frankly very unconvincing explanation of it was due to this weird fusion of care with violence. I'm not sure why that happens after the Paleolithic and why it only happens in certain areas of the world. They have no explanation for that. My explanation of this is entirely different. It's materialistic. It's historical materialism. There was a change in material factors, and that perfectly explains both why it happens after Paleolithic and why it happens in certain parts of the world and not others. And frankly, while I appreciate David Graeber in a whole bunch of ways, and I think he's an incredible intellectual in many regards, I never really trusted him with empirical analysis. And I think the book honestly gave a great disservice to the left, because it basically told everyone, just ignore class and ignore material factors, when that is just hamstringing you to understanding history at all, which is why they also can't provide a good explanation as to why you see the emergence of these Goliaths. So we cover similar things, but we have radically different interpretations and explanations as to why Goliaths emerge, and of course, how to undo them.
I think people will be surprised to hear that David Graeber doesn't address class in his analysis. But yes, the point is taken. We were talking a moment ago about societies that very deliberately forget moments of the intense development of hierarchies, and then after those hierarchies have collapsed, possibly because people have left them very deliberately, they try and forget them, or even tell stories about why we should never go back to them. Almost the exact opposite thing happens in Europe. We get this enormous moment of the at least much of what we think of as Europe now being organized into a single empire in, of course, the Roman Empire. And then we spend the next 1,700 years telling stories about why that was fantastic and why we should go back to that. And there are many attempts, the Holy Roman Empire, even Napoleon, so on. They all hark back to some extent to these sort of glory days of the Roman Empire and political unification and the emergence of Europe, although it of course includes lots of North Africa as well. Why is that completely wrong? And why is the Roman Empire much more like ISIS?
If you want to see people being crucified in hundreds or even thousands, and you want to see women being rounded up by armed young men and sold into slavery, you can, of course, go to ISIS in modern-day Syria and Iraq, or you can go to the West Roman Empire. And that's just a pretty true comparison. Like, Rome was essentially a vast machine for turning grain into swords. It was just one very effective, large-scale, militaristic Ponzi scheme, in which basically Rome takes over its neighbors, it knocks them on the head and says, hey, how about you join us? And we'll give you some taxes, but we'll otherwise treat you like okay. And we'll then go and conquer other neighbors and get even more booty. And that's pretty much the story of Rome. It's not particularly inspiring when you frame it that way. And when you actually look beyond the monuments, beyond the Colosseum, and beyond the stories of the Republic and the great leaders, you end up seeing that people didn't really benefit from this great deal. By the end of Rome, it was 75% towards the maximum theoretical level of inequality. That maximum theoretical level is essentially a situation in which one person holds the entire surplus and everyone else has just enough to get by and reproduce on. Subsistence, if you will. Rome was 3/4 of the way towards that. And even when you look at human health and human bodies, it's pretty clear that Rome wasn't necessarily good for people. So interestingly, in the Italian peninsula, in particular in Rome, people are growing taller pretty quickly before Rome emerges. And human height is a pretty good overall biophysical indicator of health. If you have a childhood which has more than enough calories, you get lots of protein, you have a diverse diet, and you additionally don't have, say, for instance, periods of starvation, famine, or disease, you're likely to be taller. And this is why places like Northern Europe tend to have taller populations. Rome, when it emerges, you actually see people start to stagnate in height. And people end up being 8 centimeters shorter than they should have been if you basically carried out the growth in height prior to the emergence of Rome. And even people outside the empire were taller than those inside the empire. So the trope we have about this big muscle-bound Germanic barbarian is kind of true. To the average Roman soldier, they would have looked that way. And interestingly, after Rome collapses, people seem to get taller, and they also have less things like bone lesions, basically trauma on the bones, and less dental cavities as well, holes in their teeth, all of which suggest they're having a better diet and probably a healthier overall. So Rome wasn't particularly good for its people. It was very good for the elite on top, but not good for most of the general populace. And it's worthwhile remembering that when you travel to Rome, it's a really cool city. It's not where most of the people lived. 95% of the population were still peasant farmers. That all being said, we can also view collapse as being sometimes a term of propaganda as well, where collapse is a process that has winners and losers, benefits and costs. And I think often for much of the populace, the benefits outweigh the costs. This is not to say that it wasn't without its bloodshed, it wasn't without turmoil and, of course, as mentioned, victims. If you were in the city of Rome during its sacking, it was a pretty horrible thing to happen. But for much of the populace, it wasn't necessarily that bad. And it's worthwhile just like caveating this because I think people often immediately think I'm saying that a future collapse will ergo also be fairly benevolent. I don't think that's the case. As I cover later in the book, there's several reasons to believe that a future collapse will be essentially a bad thing overall for everyone, including that we all now rely upon things like globalized, industrialized supply chains. We have weapons that can be used to much greater effect, things like nuclear weapons rather than muskets and swords. And additionally, the Goliath is now global rather than regional. And simply put, people can't easily become subsistence farmers or hunter-gatherers again. And indeed, there's not enough land for that to happen.
So is it inequality in some like kind of driving way? I mean, we had this kind of diagram before that we were looking at: power concentration, economic inequality and exploitation, status, economic and military competition, right? These kind of three things intensify each other, and then they also cause kind of greater inequality, and that leads to broader social fragility, right? Are those the same sort of processes that happen in Rome? And are they the same kinds of things that happen in all the collapses that you look at?
In a basic sense, yes. When you look across the world, it's pretty consistent that almost every state ends up becoming more unequal over time. And this is largely based upon the seminal work of Walter Scheidel in his book, The Great Leveler, where he looks at essentially trends in inequality over global history. And his key contention, and I think there's some bits to be challenged here, but overall it's pretty much correct, is that wealth inequality tends to increase over time unless you have what he calls a great leveler, something like mass mobilization welfare, like the world wars, a bloody revolution, like in the case of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, a pandemic, like the Black Death, or a state collapse. And unless you have one of those factors, wealth inequality tends to increase. That's for a couple of different reasons. A big one simply being that capital increases more quickly in value than wages do. That's something that obviously Thomas Piketty has pointed out from the modern world, but it also holds true of the ancient world as well. And on top of that, once you have power, once you have land, for instance, and economic power, you can very easily translate that into other forms of power. So if you're thinking about this in terms of Nann's typology of power, or my revised version, once you have economic power, you can very easily start to buy your own private armies, as, for instance, elites do both in the late Han Dynasty as well as the late Roman Empire. You can also start to buy political office. It's notable that most of the Roman bureaucracy and all the positions of authority were essentially staffed by people who came from elite families. This was not something that was open to all people. And you also can start to control more information. So people in Mesopotamia, for instance, who are the head of priestly class, etc., usually ended up having more economic power as well. So these things tend to get swapped around. Once you have some power, you can get more power. It becomes a kind of pump overall. But these are the key drivers behind why wealth inequality tends to increase over time. I mentioned before that Rome was 3/4 of the way towards this maximum theoretical limit of inequality. It's worthwhile noting the best study we have of 28 pre-modern states found that that was the average across all of them. So on average, most of them were 3/4 of the way towards that maximum theoretical limit of inequality. In the book, I put forward that increase in inequality is also an increase in vulnerability, and it's the key driver in collapse. Won't go too deep here, but much of this is premised upon the work of Peter Turchin and Dan Hoyer, what's called structural demographic theory, where they basically put forward, as I mentioned, that there's a wealth pump which increases wealth inequality over time. As you get that, you start to get an overproduction of elites. And alongside that, you also start to get an immiseration of the masses. In short, as a small number of people own things like land and capital, you start to have an increase in the cost of everyday living, what we call a cost of living crisis, what they would call popular immiseration. So you have this kind of powder keg of more and more elites competing for a small number of positions like a throne, and you have more and more people who are upset with the existing status quo. And that is a rife bed for things like coups, revolutions, and civil wars, which tend to mark most collapse events throughout history. Where I diverge a bit from Turchin and Hoyer and others is I add in a whole bunch of other factors. I don't think that popular immiseration and elite overproduction are the only explanatory factors here. Instead, I think that once you start to get growing wealth inequality, we also have signs that this is just genuinely corrosive towards society. So growing wealth inequality has been linked to everything ranging from rising social political violence to polarization, for instance. On top of that, you also start to get more corruption. So from modern studies, we can see the bidirectional relationship between wealth inequality and corruption. In short, the more corrupt you are, the more likely you are to become more unequal, and vice versa as well. And on top of all that, there's good reasons to believe that once you start to have a more homogenous small group of people making decisions and who are increasingly buffered from the impacts of the decisions, they're going to make much worse decisions, and they're less likely to essentially want to address impending disaster, particularly if it involves in changing the status quo, which they benefit from. We can see that pretty clear when it comes to fossil fuel companies and climate change today. So all these things together basically make the state increasingly hollowed out as it's captured by elites, until eventually some combination of different shocks, so in the case of Rome, disease, climatic change, and also invaders, essentially knock over the husk of what was once a very powerful state. And I think that's the primary mode of collapse throughout human history, at the very least for large-scale empires, kingdoms, and states. It's one iteration of what I call Goliath's curse, that Goliaths contain the seeds of their own demise in the form of increasing wealth inequality.
I want to, that kind of combination of things, I mean, it's a very powerful, very kind of like synoptic view of the whole thing. That combination of different modes of power, economic, military or violent power, informational, ideological power, political power. We see that also happening today in sort of various like particular people. Someone here we might think about is Elon Musk, right? Who has managed to sort of coordinate all these different kinds of things. Even military power, right? Because because SpaceX is a major government contractor. The utility of satellites is great in the Ukraine war, for example. He can personally decide whether or not the Ukrainians like get a certain kind of form of support from the Americans, which is quite like a shocking thing to realize.
Yeah.
But the informational ideological aspect there is really interesting because obviously Elon Musk is also the owner of X, formerly known as Twitter, right? Yeah. And he's sort of almost built himself not the architecture of a really robust informational landscape, but is seemingly like the late Soviet Politburo, right, who are getting very bad information about what's going on in Russia. Elon Musk has sort of built himself his own version of the Politburo that will feed him nonsense like all the time, built his own sort of corrupt bureaucracy, mostly filled with bots and so on. I mentioned this not to just dunk on Elon Musk, but in order to pivot to a sort of a different way in which people have been thinking about collapse. Because if you listen to what Elon Musk says, right, about the purpose of his immense wealth, it is to forestall existential disaster, right? He explicitly talks as if going to Mars is going to prevent the worst tragedy of happening, of the entire world exploding or nuclear exchange. We basically have a backup copy. Going to Mars is insurance for human society. And there is a kind of, in your view, perhaps a kind of a deep tragedy in that the sources of non-existential risk, but still massively substantial risk, right, are being exacerbated by the same processes that are trying to solve the problem of existential risk. Do you see that kind of tension between the different kinds of frameworks of risk?
Yeah, I think the key thing that's going on here is Musk is engaging what I call a story of subjugation. So when you look at the emergence of the very first Goliaths across the world, what tends to accompany them are different stories which justify why certain people are on top of the social pyramid. And to begin with, that usually tended to be stories of divine order or supernatural powers. So the leading hypothesis for Cahokia is that the priests at the time probably claimed to be able to control the weather and hence the harvest as well. In the case of Egypt, the pharaohs were either gods themselves or the reflections of gods. Mesopotamia, they were usually representatives of gods. And even all the way through to the high medieval age, people viewed kings as being some kind of representative god in a kind of divine chain of being. And of course, in China, we have the entire idea of the mandate of heaven, that the emperor's entire role is to basically ensure that Earth and Chinese society replicates how the heavens look, and hence everything will be in order. But in every single one of these cases, you have a justification as to why some people deserve to rule and to dominate others. The second similarity is that they're all complete and utter bullshit nonsense. We have no evidence today that the Mesopotamian kings actually were representative gods, nor do we have any evidence for the mandate of heaven, nor that the Cahokian priests could control the weather. I think today, when we think about meritocracy, or when we think about Musk's claim of, I'm preventing collapse, I'm going to ensure that we have a refuge in the form of Mars, they similarly just don't have much evidence at all. When it comes to meritocracy, every billionaire under the age of 30 inherited their wealth. Doesn't seem particularly meritocratic to me. When it comes to Mars, it's going to be incredibly difficult to terraform an entire planet. And I've yet to see any convincing argument as to why it would be easy to terraform Mars to ensure it has the right climate, the right soil, everything else in order to establish any kind of viable population there, in comparison to just, ensuring that Earth is livable and habitable. So as a backup plan, it seems like a really fucking bad one. And I think, frankly, it is just a story of subjugation. It's a way of justifying his role in society by saying, look, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of benefits. You can't see them right now. They're not exactly visible. But let's ignore all the actual very visible harms I'm causing to society because of this dream of Mars utopia. All the other ones like immortality, for instance, or superintelligence solving every single problem we have. I think every single one of those is basically a story of subjugation.
You don't buy the myth. Well, you don't buy the sort of Brian Johnson living forever, getting maximally healthy kind of line. I can see you living forever, Luke.
I'm awfully healthy. No, I mean, from everything I've read, biologically, it seems like we do have a maximum lifespan of roughly 120 years. No one's ever gone anything close to getting beyond that. I've had friends who've met Brian, and honestly, I'm not sure if it's worth the trade-off. He doesn't seem particularly healthy when you meet him in person. And, he has to control his life to the extent where he doesn't ever go out and party, drink alcohol. He tries to control his cortisol by basically never being stressed whatsoever. But in short, I don't believe in that. And I do believe that if we end up having life extension, it's going to be preferentially used for the rich and not for most of humans.
I do not have a good pivot to this one, so I'm just going to launch back into the historical narrative that we were talking about. Maybe I do, actually. I mean, speaking of death, one of the great levelers you mentioned earlier was, of course, the Black Death, right? Which is the formation, to some extent, of the... it means because lots of workers have died, right? It means that working power is... labor power, right, is more valuable suddenly, and therefore workers are able to negotiate for higher wages, and it transforms the class structure of Europe to some extent. When we're thinking about these massive events, like that one seems like a sort of non-human exogenous shock, right? Like it's a flea-borne disease that comes, I believe, on rats, right? It spreads throughout Europe, and clearly there's a kind of a social equivalent here, we could say, with kind of modern pandemics. But it also initiates this period of exploration, and it initiates a period of colonialism worldwide, where a whole collection of other societies around the world, including the thing you sort of referenced earlier, which is the Jared Diamond's guns, germs, and steel sort of thesis, the period of European colonial domination, right, which is how we get white Australians, right? This kind of period begins. This is also a period of collapse to some extent. And you have a very nuanced discussion of the way in which colonialism is and isn't and sort of functions as, and maybe is kind of different from collapse. But it seems to me that we are looking at a whole series of very deliberate induced destructions, what I called earlier applied collapse, right? Is that, how do you see that kind of period of human history?
In order to answer that, it's worthwhile taking a step back and defining collapse. Something we probably should have done earlier, but in the book I put forward that...
We're doing it now.
Exactly. Collapse is the enduring and rapid fragmentation and contraction of power networks. We've already discussed some of these power networks in terms of man's typology. When a state falls apart, we call it a state collapse or a state failure. When the economy plummets, we tend to call it either a recession or an economic collapse. When a population is destroyed very quickly, we tend to refer to it as a population collapse or a population bust. When all these things happen together, that's when we can think of it as a societal collapse. And this will always be subjective. How much does the economy have to fall apart? And what functions does the state need to be destroyed in order for you to consider a state failure? There's always going to be subjectivity there. There'll always be subjectivity in terms of how long-lasting does it need to be and how rapid does it need to be. Putting that aside, what you see happen during colonization is that there are sometimes fates worse than collapse. So in the book I put forward that in many cases, we don't think about colonization as being collapse because you still have actually even more rapid increases in things like population density, in things like hierarchy, and in energy capture. There's the sheer amount of energy materials being processed by the economy. And those are the things we tend to associate with civilization, as people call it, what I call Goliath. And when you look at, say, for instance, India, life expectancy goes down dramatically once the Brits take over. Its basic economic industries like cloth manufacturing and textiles end up being essentially destroyed because Well, both there's a large number of internal regulations dissuading their use, but also huge tariffs get put on them in order to make British textiles more valuable and competitive. But we don't tend to talk about it as a collapse because essentially India, in terms of just GDP, grows immensely under the British. Human suffering is pretty bad, but GDP continues to increase, population density ultimately tends to increase as well. And additionally, you start to have more and more complex layers of hierarchy and bureaucracy. So in those kind of cases, we tend not to think of it as a collapse, and perhaps it's not worthwhile thinking of it as a collapse, but in many ways, it's a fate worse than collapse. In others, like, say, for instance, the genocide that occurs in Australia and Tasmania, or just the enormous destruction of both human lives and culture for the Australian Aborigines, or for that case for the Native Americans, that's probably something that can be more appropriately termed as a collapse. And it's something that is far, far worse than what happens in, say, for instance, Rome. Here we're talking about enormous, unfathomable losses of life in both Australia as well as Native American populations. We're speaking of potentially population losses of 80% plus. And the Basin in Mexico is probably 90% plus. And on top of that, their entire culture is transformed and in many cases lost. And it's important to, of course, always note here that these communities show an incredible amount of resilience. And of course, many of the languages, cultures, and customs continue through to this day. But it's also mistaken to think that this did not have an incredibly, almost apocalyptic impact on them in many ways. So colonization has this kind of spectrum, this kaleidoscope of different outcomes across the world. Some are clear-cut cases of collapse. I'd say, for instance, the Aztec and Incan empires in some regards, as mentioned, Australia and the Native Americans, and others less clear. But the key thing here is that through this process of collapse and destruction, you're basically forging the creation of a new global Goliath. In the book, this links to a bigger point I make of when you look throughout history, collapses aren't the worst thing to happen. Instead, it's actually the creation and expansion of empires. When we look at the very worst events throughout human history in terms of just sheer mortality, the only one that seems to really crack the 10 to 11 to 10% barrier of roughly 10% of the global population being lost in less than a century is essentially the colonization of the Americas. Nothing else really gets close. And collapses, as I mentioned, seem to have a much more kind of mixed track record, and some were actually beneficial for most people. When it comes to the expansion of empires and their creation, that's where you start to see these really large increases in violence and human suffering.
I guess the question kind of politically is to know that the world that we live in, right, to know that this, what you're calling the global Goliath, is formed through acts of mass death. And in some ways, those are accidental, right, because of the proliferation of diseases, which the Europeans didn't do deliberately, or there are some cases where probably they did. How does that change the way in which we relate to the society we now live in? Like, how did it change? How does it change it for you to know that the society that you, well, I mean, you're Australian, right? We've talked about that a few times, but like, that society very directly, but also I'm British, and also obviously the British and Australia are very closely connected. Mm. And the wealth of Britain is based on this destruction or the construction of a sort of collection of what Alfred Crosby calls neo-Europes, right? Mm. These kind of places of settler colonialism where the whole landscape is transformed. New species are imported, new kinds of, and that means both trees, but also diseases and animals. The whole world is kind of terraformed. What does it do to our conception of who we are and what the political value of our cultures is to know that they were forged in what is to date the most apocalyptic event in human history? For
me, it made me question the fundamental narratives we have around the origins of our nation state. Australia, for instance, we tend to have a really big emphasis upon the Anzac myth, so that essentially we Australians had a whole bunch of very peculiar and important characteristics that made us effectively much more effective and brave in war. And this is pretty common across a whole bunch of different founding national mythologies. They usually point towards different militaristic episodes as being the kind of founding episodes of national identity. It's made me question those much more. and to just appreciate how much of our societies are built upon appropriation, slavery, warfare. That shouldn't, I think, primarily lead to just some sense of collective guilt and self-flagellation, but rather we should think about practically how do we ensure this doesn't happen again. And it's worthwhile remembering that most of this hasn't really stopped per se. In the book, I talk about how when we look at the greatest threats of our times, things like lethal autonomous weapons, climate change, AI, they're all built upon global inequality. If you want to build a large language model, or you want to build a autonomous lethal drone, you need to have cobalt. And roughly 70% of the world's global cobalt supply is sourced from the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, as we mentioned before. Around about just under half of the production is done by artisanal miners who essentially operate in an entirely unregulated fashion. They tend to be working in very dangerous conditions and prone to things like tunnel collapses. And something around about, I think it's 40,000 of the workers are usually children. And those are probably conservative estimates, if anything. These people work in some of the most atrocious slave-like conditions possible, but it's more or less for the basis of the entire global economy. You know, if cobalt dries up, suddenly compute dries up and the entire AI industry and computing dries up. And the reason why compute and those microchips are cheap is because of that exploited labor. So in many ways, these things haven't really changed. And the prosperity of many countries, including Australia, is built at least in part upon that exploitation. And I view that more accurate knowledge of the past and of the genesis of our states as being largely a recognition that we should change the way the world operates today, rather than just a need to feel guilty about our historical past. I think it's also worth noting here that this is not something that just Europe did. We should not forget, nor necessarily forgive, what happened with European colonization, but when the Spanish arrived in Central and South America, they encountered empires that were not dissimilar to what they had back in Europe. And I'd wager that, we already see that the Aztecs were very willing to conquer and enslave peoples all around them as well. So this is something that's not just unique to Europe. And I think colonization in some form or another on a global scale probably happens eventually if Europe doesn't do it. This is more of a problem of empire rather than of Europeans per se.
Sure. I guess I want to end on let's say a hopeful note. I always dislike the what is to be done question, partly because that means I have to then do something. But what is to be done? You have in the book a sort of a collection of very different views of how it is that we could move away, firstly, from the inequality that is driving the fundamental risk landscape that we face. All these different risks that we're talking about have, in your view, a sort of a single common driver, and that is deep global inequality. How do we move away from that? Right? What are the kind of political technologies that we can develop that allow us to get away from that? And would that be enough? I mean, you said earlier at the very beginning that the tendency is very much towards what you called self-termination. Can we get off this road? And if so, how?
Mm-hmm. In terms of reducing individual risk areas, things like climate change and nuclear weapons, it's pretty clear we have technical solutions to all of these. During the 1990s, the US was dismantling thousands of nuclear weapons every year. When it comes to climate change, every single major economy has a very clear pathway to rapid decarbonization by the middle of the century, which can be done at a fairly low cost. These are not technical problems anymore. In the book, I point towards a need to level each of the forms of power. The big one, I think, is using what are called citizen assemblies or citizens' juries. The key here is that when you start to randomly select people from a population and have them deliberate, it starts to select against the darker angels of our nature. Suddenly, you no longer have a system where people who want power the most and are willing to get it through manipulation and force are the ones who are selected for. You're no longer selecting for dominant status seekers nor for the dark triad. Instead, you're just selecting at random. And additionally, Once you start to have just random people in a room rather than political parties, you start to have more genuine deliberation. And we see that this tends to reduce things like polarization. It also just tends to result in better decision making as well. This is, if I could choose one intervention, this would be the one I'd choose in order to basically improve the world and avoid future collapse. In the book, I have one example, what I call the Trinity Jury, which is based off the Trinity experiment back in 1945, the creation of the world's first atomic weapon. Essentially, the US creates the world's first atomic weapon and detonates it in the sands of New Mexico in July 1945. Prior to that Trinity test, there was a morbid set of bets being placed by the scientists involved, led by Enrico Fermi, asking whether or not the world would be destroyed by igniting the bomb. That's because one of his colleagues, the physicist Edward Teller, had made a calculation that there was a non-zero probability that igniting the bomb would also ignite the entire atmosphere of Earth, killing every single shred of life, not just humans, but the entire biosphere. By that time, the US also knew that the Nazis were no longer either capable of nor pursuing the construction of their own atomic weapon. So this wasn't about beating the Nazis to the bomb. Nonetheless, they went ahead and took that risk. In the book, I pose a pretty simple thought experiment of imagine if you had a citizens' jury in which you randomly selected US citizens at the time, nurses, farmers, cleaners. You gave them information and you asked them to make a decision as to whether we should detonate the bomb. What conclusion would they come to? And almost without fail,
yeah, everyone says, do not do that.
Super clear, yeah. Pretty much everyone I've spoken to just has that reaction of like, well, yeah, of course not, it's stupid. And in part, I think they're thinking of, if I was involved in that assembly, how would I react and how would I vote? And very few people would want to do that. And I think this is true of a whole bunch of things. If back in the 1970s, you had a citizens' jury operating in the boardroom of ExxonMobil, it's highly unlikely they would have said, you know what, it's a really good idea to bury all the information we have about climate change and to run millions of dollars into misinformation and disinformation campaigns to cast doubt on the science of climate change. I want you to lie to my friends and families and hide all this evidence. It just wouldn't happen. So across the board, democracy seems to be one of the best ways to reduce global risk. But in the book, I also point out that it's hard to have, I think, sustainable democracy if you have billionaires, if you have large distortions in economic equality. You can have billionaires or you can have democracy. You can't have both in the long term. And similarly, I think the same is true of information power and violent power. If you have too large a concentration in any of the forms of power, it's likely to spill over into the others eventually. So you need to have some kind of basic level of equality across each of them. And I think that's necessary in order to avoid collapse in the long term.
In 2019, France did citizens' assemblies, particularly around the question of climate change. And Emmanuel Macron, who is the president of France, still is, looked at the recommendations and he said, fantastic, great recommendations. I'm not going to do any of those things. I think maybe he decided to do one or two of them, the very minor ones, but they weren't the core things that the Citizens' Assembly had actually recommended. And so I totally am with you on the Citizens' Assemblies, but they require a form of power, do they not? And maybe this is, again, where we're sort of talking across a kind of very minor political divide. They require a kind of power of enforcement.
Yep.
Right? And that seems to be the sort of the missing crux, because we do citizens' assemblies. They don't go anywhere.
This is the biggest criticism of citizens' assemblies and juries. And it's also, I have found, funnily enough, one of the biggest criticisms of the book as well, is that I point out all these different ways in which we can address the problem, identify what the problem is, but I don't give a detailed, comprehensive, point-by-point blueprint and roadmap as to how you get there. To be frank, that's a very big ask, and that's something for a future book. It's also just a weird ask to be like, can you please identify all the problems throughout human history and how we end up with existential risk? But also, I want to have not just solutions, but a point-by-point blueprint for every single country to get there. Pretty tall order. But in short,
I believe in you. I believe it. I think you could do it. I think if anyone's got a chance, it's you.
Potentially, but that's something to happen in a much longer term with a much larger team. It's something I don't do in this book, and it's something I have some nascent thoughts about, but nothing super clear. And I think, frankly, when we look at social change and even revolutions, it's very difficult to actually plot them out beforehand.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Sorry, I'm quoting Emmanuel Macron there. That's not what I meant to do. But maybe you need, in order to have that level of hubris about the capacity to solve all the world's problems, a little bit more of the dark triad. Maybe. Luke Kemp, thank you so much for doing your own research, and I hope to see you very soon.
And Richard, thank you so much for the fascinating conversation.